everyone. Welcome to our Zip Chat today. This is Jill Hurston from Accelerate. So with that being said, I'm going to introduce our host for episode 11, Mike Watson. He is our SVP of Engineering at Accelerate. Mike, over to you.
Thanks, Jill, and welcome everyone. Like Jill said, this is episode 11. We're going to be talking about maximizing software productivity. Just briefly, I'll introduce myself. Mike Watson. I'm SVP of Agile Product Engineering here at Accelerate, and I work with clients to help them understand how to better work not only with their own teams, but also with distributed development teams. That's part of my specialty. So with that, let's move on to, let me introduce the panelists first. Sorry about that, guys. So with me, I have Mickey Mantle, Ron Lichty, and Krishna Kumar. Mickey and Ron have worked together to write the book, Managing the Unmanageable. I suggest checking that out, especially after hearing the session today. You might be even more interested in that. And then Dr. Krishna Kumar is someone who, like me, really likes to think about how building software, how to best build software, I guess is what I'm trying to say. I've really enjoyed getting to know Krishna, talking about these things. And hopefully everyone enjoys meeting with them. So let's begin on the topic. But before we start, let's do a quick icebreaker poll and see where people are at related to managing productivity or thinking about productivity. Software productivity is something that is nearly impossible to measure. I think at one point I called it an NP complete problem, where maybe it is possible, but who knows if we have enough time to actually figure it out. So here we're just looking to see how people feel about where they're at with productivity. And it's pretty subjective at this point in my mind. So, feel free to answer however you like.
Okay, Mike, I'm going to close it. I think we have just about everybody who has voted.
Perfect. Yeah, let's see the results.
There you go.
So no one feels like they're productive enough. I'm not surprised. I didn't think anyone would answer that. Yeah, and I think the distribution here is not surprising at all. Anyone on the panel have any thoughts on this?
Can you ever do a good enough job?
It sounds about right to me.
Yeah, fair enough. Fair enough. All right, so my first question I'll throw out at Ron. And Ron, I know you've been really successful leading teams. You've built a great consulting practice. We've talked many times. You've been on webinars for us in the past. Tell us your thought about productivity, what that looks like.
Yeah, so a little by way of introducing myself. So I was a software developer for 7 years. I cut my teeth managing at Apple Computer as a manager, was a manager through that and through a few entertainment, and then became a director of engineering at a few entertainment companies and at Charles Schwab. I got promoted to a VP of engineering at Schwab and led software development at a few very large companies and a few startups before I began consulting about 9 years ago. So how I think about productivity, I'm gonna give you 3 very quick answers. One of them is in terms of outcomes, and I think it's really important to think about outcomes as this is where the value is. It's not about output; it's about outcomes, and about outcomes for our customers. And having regular deliveries of code that move the needle is really important. Secondly, I think about productivity in terms of what we can do as managers and leaders. How do we affect that? And that was part of what Mickey and I had been having breakfast to have that breakfast on weekends for a decade, trying to solve that problem, trying to answer that problem for each other and for ourselves. At the point at which we said, we really ought to share these conversations we've been having with other managers and create a book around it, and thus came Managing the Unmanageable, our book around what managers can do, what leaders can do to foment productivity, and then third, what do teams do? What do high performance teams do, and are the teams that I'm leading doing those things? And so I also co-authored the study of product team performance. And in the product team performance, we ask people we poll people all over on product teams all over the world to ask, is your team high productivity or low productivity or something in between? And then we ask about practices, and we've got a data scientist on our team who then does the correlations and looks for, are there correlations between practices and high performance teams? And we found things like effective onboarding, effective stand-ups daily, having executive sponsors, having strong product management, having a written definition of done that was written by the team, not by people outside the team. Having having substantial backlogs, not just a backlog for the next sprint, but substantial backlogs, and having sized all those stories, as well as, and really important, cross-functional collaboration and trust.
Yeah, interesting, Ron. So let me ask a question to Krishna. So Krishna, you, like I mentioned in the intro, you've been studying this for a long time. Do you have anything to add to what Ron said about productivity there?
No, I think I agree with pretty much everything Ron said there. I might be coming at it from a slightly different angle because I've kind of gone back and forth between engineering leadership roles and kind of hands-on development. I still do, pretty much half and half in my time. And I think one of the things that, I look at productivity from a software team like Ron does as outcomes, but at a high level, we look at a few different things. A productive team is responsive to the business. It's well aligned to the business, and you can do all that while also producing well-engineered code. And I think that's a distinction I've seen between the really high-performing teams and kind of teams that sometimes have, some more difficulty kind of making that balance. So it's kind of speed, balance with quality, alignment with the business. And my practice has been, I do a consulting practice as well, which has a technology bent to it, based on how to measure these things. So how do you actually quantify some of this stuff, and how do you actually integrate data into the day-to-day engineering and management process in such a way that we can actually objectively understand some of these things in a healthy fashion.
Yeah, perfect. I have a similar view, Krishna, that it's really about the business outcomes, but doing things effectively and with high quality is typically going to be give you the best productivity. And that's because quality issues generally are a huge drain on productivity. And so if you don't have high quality, then it's hard to keep high productivity.
Good engineering. I mean, it's very important.
Yeah. So, Mickey, anything you want to add to this topic?
Not at this point.
Awesome. So it sounds like we've got a pretty good definition there. So Mickey, why don't we talk about measuring productivity? I know you've been searching for, a good way to manage and measure software process and projects. Do you have any thoughts on how to measure productivity?
Sure, lots of thoughts. But first, let me just kind of introduce myself a little bit. Ron went over part of my history, but I've actually been developing software and hardware for over 50 years now. All of them in startups, although the first ones actually weren't called startups, they were just called companies. And including companies such as Pixar, Broderbund Software, and a company called Gracenote, all of which grew to be quite big and large companies, usually resulting in my leaving when they got to be too big. So I like startup environments, and along the way, I started managing people, not just developing software, but manage them. And I always found the process of managing software people difficult because the process is so opaque. There's not a lot of visibility you have into the actual process. And so I actually had a earth-shattering experience it was back in the 90s when they first started showing sports graphics on TV. I was actually watching the NBA final playoff game, and they showed the shot making of the basketball players. And I went, oh my God, if they can do that for basketball, why can't we do that for software? And so ever since, and Ron could attest to this, I've been looking for tools to help me do this. Now, over the past few years, there's been a plethora of tools come out. And as Ron would again testify, I've been very interested in whatever ones I can get my hands on to take and measure them. But going back to sports for a second and why we should do it, well, if you look at any sport today, and these are people who have, the biggest egos, the most sensitive, at least many of them, okay? And they're measured on their productivity individually and as a team. Okay, so why can't we do that for software people? There's some who say, well, you have to be very careful, they're fragile. But as a manager, I want as much information about what's going on behind the scenes of the software development process as possible. And that's what I think some of these productivity measures can provide.
Yeah, so do you think measuring like productivity itself, like maybe something like throughput or cycle time or something like that, that may not be a great measure, but do you think there's some indicators below that that might be better measures? This is actually an open question for anyone. I just popped into my head.
Well, there are many, many measures, effort, cycle time, as you mentioned. The list is very long about what you can measure. And I believe we should measure whatever is possible to measure. Whether we use them or not, how we use them or not, that's a different story. But we should be measuring everything we can.
It's like flying an airplane, right? I mean, when you look at the cockpit of an airplane, you have a few hundred measurements going on at the same time, right? I think they all matter. I think that the different measurements matter in different contexts. And if you're flying, if you're running an engineering team with 40 or 50 people, all that, the data that you need to actually sort of understand what's going on is actually fairly large. It never comes down to 1 or 2 or 3 metrics. It's, the whole context, the team health, quality of the code, the performance of engineering delivery, but you need to have them in one place, and that's kind of that's what the challenge is, I think. But a lot of what happens today is data is like spread all over the place. People don't know how to use it in a systematic fashion. People don't know when to use it. So there's no culture of data in software engineering, which is kind of really ironic because we spend all our lives building database tools for other people, and when it comes to our own work, we're happy to fly blind, and that's kind of sad.
So I also think that we should take and measure things by results. I mean, my whole management career, that was the key measurement. Was I getting the results I needed from my teams or individuals? That was always the highest thing I looked for. Now, how did I measure that? Sometimes it was empirical, sometimes it wasn't. There are lots of ways you gather that information, but I think results are what we're looking for. But I would have given my right arm, maybe my left arm, to have the kinds of productivity measures in place when I was managing teams of 10s, 20s, hundreds of programmers.
And also cost and effect, I think, because some of these, you have a big number that you want to look at, which is your output or outcome that you're trying to measure, but then you need to understand why the things that you do affect those outcomes. And that's really the details, the smaller measurements that go into that, and being able to build a framework around understanding, well, if this happens, then that happens, right? That's kind of the challenge, really started to build that culture in software development.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I was doing a talk a couple years ago, and I had this question of like, how do you know if you're, in this case, it was about agility and if you're agile enough. And I said, if you're meeting the business demands, you'll just know. Yeah. Like it becomes kind of obvious because the fighting amongst executives slows down and all of that. So, maybe it's not completely obvious to measure. Now, let's take a different tact on this. So Ron, you and I have talked some, like we've talked about, and you're skeptical of measurements. So why don't you tell me a little bit about your opinion there?
So I won't. I'm wary of measurements. I
Very
would say
much.
rather than being skeptical of
Good reason.
measurements. And I'm really focused on I want balance. So I really like Krishna's metaphor of all of those instruments in a 747's cockpit. But I also know that we can get stuck on metric fixation, where that belief that we can replace professional judgment with just numbers. And so we need that balance between those two things. We also need to recognize that metrics are important. Metrics come up in three different ways. And one of them is for teams, one of them is for managers, us, engineering managers, and one of them is for business managers. And
Right.
and part of my wariness comes from having seen really bad business managers using really bad metrics, really zeroing in on, well, here's the easiest number I can use, and it used to be lines of code. All right, how many lines of code is somebody writing? Well, we all know in engineering management that that's not the measure. We want fewer lines of code, not more. But and so now that it's switched over the last few years into velocity, let me get down to what's the velocity of each individual. Well, individuals don't have velocity. Teams have velocity. And furthermore, team velocity is it's a measurement for the team. The second the team thinks that somebody outside the team is measuring it, the team will game it, because there's a rule of thumb that what gets measured gets manipulated. And I had a client who shared that with me, because I was sharing this problem of don't let velocity leak outside your team, because the second it does, velocity will start going up, because the smart teams all know that. Smart teams will gain velocity and will make velocity go up. Nothing else will change. The output will be the same. The outcomes will be the same. Outcomes actually might be less, but the velocity will go flying up, because anybody knows that all you have to do is increase the story points on your stories, and velocity will go up.
Yeah.
So
Exactly
we
right.
want good measurements for teams to use. Velocity is a team measurement. We want good measurements for managers to use, but we don't want them to replace professional judgment. And then we need to get our business partners off of zeroing in on one metric, and recognize that we are guiding the plane with our professional judgment. It was professional judgment that landed that plane in the was it the Hudson or the East River? But I think it was the Hudson. But it was professional judgment that did that, not metrics. But that guy was looking at all of those metrics across his dashboard, I bet you.
Yeah. It was influencing his decision making, but he ultimately is making the decisions, right? Yeah.
And I think to back up what Mickey also said, I think the visibility is a big part of this. I think engineering is opaque to managers. Nobody sees what is actually happening. And I think that is one of the things that we could do a better job of, because in a manufacturing floor, for instance, your managers actually have a lot more visibility into what's happening on the floor. We use manufacturing as an analogy often, right? But in software, the people doing the work are kind of pretty invisible in terms of how they work. And so that's actually one of the challenges as well, to actually kind of getting good metrics and the right things to measure, right?
Yeah, and I love that Mickey has done this deep dive into metrics as my writing partner, because it means that I can ask Mickey every time I want another measurement. What's the state of the art right now? Because he's just constantly been digging into this stuff since he saw those graphs of tennis players and where they make their shots and where they make their successful shots.
Yeah, great stuff. So Ron, let's shift gears a little bit and talk about essentially about people, right? So morale on the team and people are really a big part of how teams are successful in software. It's because we're building, because the people are the machines, right? If you're thinking about widget factories and things like that, the people and the knowledge that we create is actually what we're working with, and people are sort of infallible. So we've talked about and actually there's a visual up right now where it talks about things that demotivate people. Do you want to talk about those demotivators and what we've been calling essentially hygiene for foundational factors for happiness?
Yeah, one of the things, and many of you out there who are managers know this. One of the things that's really amazing is when you go from being a programmer to being a manager, and when you go from being a manager to a director, and a director to a VP of engineering, you do some things that surprise you. And one of the things that surprised me as a manager at Apple was finding myself reading the Harvard Business Review. And and it turned out that one of my colleagues had given me this article from the Harvard Business Review that happens to be the most reprinted Harvard Business Review article ever. It was an article by Frederick Hertzberg, who pioneered this notion that there are not just motivators in the world to people, to human beings. They're not just motivators, but they're also demotivators. And he pioneered this thought of we need to tease apart the motivators and the demotivators. And here you've got a chart up of the motivators. I'm going to switch back to the demotivators one, if you would, Mike. The demotivators, and so he called them foundational factors. And the foundational factors are, he also called them hygiene factors. And he basically said, you can't use the things that are here in the blue without having the ones in the red taken care of. Those are hygiene factors, and unless you get the hygiene factors taken care of, that's going to be a problem. So in order to, and so Mickey and I together, so Hertzberg did a ton of data science in figuring out what these are for all thought workers. And we took a look at, well, so how does that differ for programmers, and dug in, and the blue ones, as I said, are motivators. The red ones are if we don't have them, are demotivators. So if you don't have respect for your supervisor, you're going to be demotivated. If you're not having fun, you're going to be demotivated. Those are hygiene factors or foundational factors. You've got to have respect for your supervisor and having fun and learning and growing in working conditions. You don't necessarily motivate people with those, although when the blue one's also high, you do, like with learning and growing and having fun. But take a look at company policies and administration. Nobody joins companies for company policies, and almost nobody for company policies and administration. But I bet you all know somebody who left a company for company policies and administration, or left a company for unethical management, or left a company for lack of respect for your supervisor. So that's us. That's really important, that we be respected and ethical, and block out company policies and administration that are abhorrent.
Yeah, it's not, I mean, that last point is pretty critical, like shielding your people from bad policies a lot of times necessary, especially if you're in a larger organization where the policy isn't really about engineering, it's about like this big global brand or something. So I think that's an important part of at least big company management.
Yeah,
So,
we have to think about the culture that it takes for programmers and programming teams to thrive in. Mickey and I wrote a whole chapter on creating that culture, and it starts with what's our company culture. And even when our company culture is stellar, there still may be pieces to it that don't apply well and get in the way of programming teams. So company cultures are often set by salespeople who are in a competitive environment with each other. And software development, on the other hand, is a team sport. And we need to work as teams and focus on that teamwork and not on heroics.
Yeah, good point. Good point. So let's shift gears a little bit. So assuming you have a good foundation, and Mickey, hopefully you can help me with this one. Assuming you have that, so what actually leads to better motivation, right? So we know there's these motivational factors. If we get those all shored up, that doesn't mean necessarily that people are going to be wowed and moving, rapidly in their job. Talk a little bit about that.
Sure. Well, one of the Ron and I discussed this at length as we were writing our book, and one of the things we found from our own experience was that if you can in some way, so if you have the ability to project your company or your mission of the company in such a way that you can change the world, it's an incredible motivator. That's what Steve Jobs did with, way back when. Do you want to sell sugar water, and he wanted to change the world when he recruited the new CEO. So that's a very important factor. But having interesting work, having fun, having great working conditions, these are also very good things. And in these two bar charts, which come from our book, you can actually tease out what the causes of dissatisfaction, the causes of satisfaction, as we see them in high-tech companies today.
Yeah, so Mickey, there's a question coming from the audience. What does the upside mean in this chart?
But it means maybe stock options, some upside in terms of career growth, income, or stock options, often presented as upside. You get an option, it could go 10x. So the promise of upside is actually an incredible motivator. At least it was in my career and a lot of people I know.
Yeah, but notice that it's like the sixth. You have to walk through making a difference in the world and having fun and toys and technology and learning and growing before you get to upside. So it's the first compensation related motivator, and it's way down the list after a bunch of other things. So we as managers really have to pay attention to a bunch of stuff in order to motivate our people.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Yeah, that is interesting. So one of the things I was noticing when I was reading this chart is like having fun and learning and growing, as you mentioned, works in both manners, right? So creating a fun environment where people feel like they can learn is going to be like really critical because it satisfies both conditions, interestingly enough.
Yeah.
I think one thing that I noticed here, Mike, if I may say something, is the idea that there is kind of an engineering culture and a management culture which are distinct from each other is also very prevalent, I think, in our discussions implicit here. I think a lot of the faster moving high-tech companies are making that distinction a little less stark, and I think that goes to alignment as well. I think when your engineering teams are kind of well aligned with what the business wants, you have a lot less of this boundary between what the manager wants and what the engineering team wants. It goes both ways. I mean, engineering team understands the business, and business understands technology as well. And I think that bidirectional transfer is also kind of critical for getting agility and all these other things we talk about.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. Because the way that I like to lead teams, I try to think of it as a flat hierarchy, although there has to be a hierarchy, right? There has to be command and control, but I don't think of any role as more important than any other role. I don't know if the three of you think the same way, but that's definitely the way I look at it. It's like, sure, there's someone that has to be at the top of the tree and they have to make different decisions than an engineer is making on any given day, but they all have to work together like a football team.
You need to be informed by each other, though,
in order for the play to work out.
So I think Christian, I think that's an interesting observation, but I think there's a broader spread than that. So I think that there are more startups where there's more alignment between the business side or the company side and the engineering side, but I can speak to clients that I'm involved with where I also see founders, non-technical founders, and or CEOs who've been brought in to run the company subsequently who have no experience in technology, asking the question, well, it's so easy to measure sales. Why can't you give me one measurement for your development team? Why can't you give me one measure for that?
Yeah. Although interestingly, my wife was complaining that the same is true in marketing.
Aha.
But that's a non sequitur here. So let's move on from a little bit, and so let's actually go to a poll, our next poll. I think that's the right next thing to do here.
There you go, Mike. It's on the screen.
Yeah, thanks. So we're talking about employee satisfaction, and I was just wondering if anyone has any experience or like process around figuring out how happy employees are. I know HR every once in a while does it at a high level, but it would be interesting to know if this is a focus of the managers on the call here.
It would be interesting if we and polling online doesn't have the possibility of it, but to correlate these questions with size of company and age of company.
Yeah, it would, because there might be more formality in larger, older organizations. That's probably what you're alluding to.
Mm-hmm.
All right, so here's the result. So it looks like most people are on the yes side, either formally or informally, they're doing something, which is actually great. I mean, that's, in my opinion, the right thing to do. Even if it's just as simple as doing one-on-ones, I think that's really helpful, just to make sure that you're actually, understanding the employees and how they're feeling and how they are doing against those factors that we just talked about. With that, Ron, do you want to talk a little bit about measuring this stuff? Since we're,
Yes. Yeah, so a little bit about team health, and I think one of the measures that too often gets left out. We focus on productivity, but one of the things we want to know is team happiness and team health. To the team happiness notion, I loved an anecdote that Rich Sheridan, who started a company called Menlo Innovations in Ann Arbor, Michigan, shared, in which he had clients who were like, well, I don't care how happy your team is. And his response was, oh, great. So I have two teams, one of which is really happy and one of which is really happy, which really unhappy. Which of them do you want working on your stuff? And he said, the funny thing is no one picks the unhappy team. We all know that we want happy teams working on our stuff. We all know from our professional judgment, and even business people, maybe especially business people, know from their professional judgment that they want happy teams working on their stuff. The team health measurements, Henrik Nieberg pioneered measuring team health, and there's a bunch of questions of how do we measure team health. What are the categories of measuring team health? And Nieberg has teams. So he calls his team squads, and so we've got 7 squads here that are each self-reporting, and oftentimes on a bi-monthly or on a quarterly basis. So self-reporting on all those categories on the left. And there's 2 measures here. And the really interesting thing, there's not only green, yellow, red, but there's also directional. So which direction are we moving in? So if you see red going down, that's like absolute worst. That's really not happening. But when we've got a bunch of teams, it's hard for senior management to get a view into the teams and into the team health and into team happiness. And this is a way of doing it, is having teams self-report. And then be able to gather this stuff and look at where do we need to help? Where do we need to get impediments out of the way? Where do we need to support our teams? Where do we need to enable them? 5 years ago, Atlassian added its team health monitors into the Jira product, and the team health monitors do that green, yellow, red thing, scorecards as well. And they also added team playbooks, in which there are roughly under an hour team exercises that teams can use to work on each of these areas if they find themselves struggling in one of the areas that Atlassian's team health monitor.
Interesting.
This particular chart, I saw this for the first time today, Ron, so I was really impressed with it. One of the things, if you notice, it does is it actually, for the first time, connects what people do with the delivery process. So the things I liked over there, health of the code base, mission, pawns or players, they really go into the mix of technology and process that is unique to software engineering. Software is one of the few places where the machine that you use to do the work, the code base, can affect your productivity, and often engineers don't understand that. Our job is to change code. That's what we do every day, right? And if it's hard to work with that code, it becomes very hard to actually deliver value, right? I love the fact that this particular dashboard actually connects all those pieces in one place. I mean, it's beautiful, perfect.
I should note that Spotify, that Nieberg, the first time he published this, had a different list on the left, and so this gets updated, and it can get updated through executive retrospectives. Are we getting the information we need? It can get updated through team retrospectives. Are we giving the information our executives need in order to support us? And then if we've got the right selection on the left, then the executive team's got at a very quick glance can look at squad 4 and say, they're firing. They're doing pretty well. I don't need to focus in on them, but boy, I could really help squad 2. Let me drill in on supporting that team and helping bring happiness back to squad 2.
It's really nice. I really love it.
So just last bit on this particular section and topic. Mickey, do you have any tips for us on how to keep morale high? Like any, cookies of wisdom that you've developed over time?
So going back to our demotivators, first of all, take care of all those hygiene factors which cause dissatisfaction. Because if you don't do that, motivating your team and keeping them happy is going to be difficult. Now, some things are out of your control. Quite frankly, I've known of startups, I'm sure you all have, who struggle financially. Okay, and that makes it difficult to have high morale, for example. So some things are difficult, and you have to find ways to go above and beyond it to take and hide that or minimize the impact of things like that in order to have a happy team and have good morale. So there are lots of things to take and pay attention to, but most of them are people things. It's not technology things. It's making sure that you have a team that's well coached, that you have managers in place that actually value people, and those are the things that really make a difference in morale.
Yeah, like I mentioned earlier, I've always found one-on-ones to be a very successful tool to keep, to basically keep everyone on the same page and to really understand how people feel. If you build a rapport with people and you dig in, they'll tell you how they really feel. Whereas, on the surface, some of these measurements, like even these self-reported ones, don't always reflect reality.
Yeah, and of course, I did one-on-ones with my teams for as long as I was a manager, quite frankly. And nobody taught me how to do it. It just came naturally that I wanted to understand what people were working on, how they felt about things, what their aspirations were. And you get value from that as well in getting to know the people, not just as somebody who's working for you, but as a person. And so, that's the kind of managers you want in place, in my opinion.
Yeah, so there was a question that came in from the audience, and it was basically saying, are these satisfaction and dissatisfaction factors different by individual? And I think they modify slightly by individual, usually not majorly. And the only way you really know is you have to get to know those individuals, right? So that's kind of breaking the rules of management, like old school management, is you actually have to know your people in order to understand these factors and how they influence them. Like some people really do care about money more than anything else. And you have to know that if you're going to be successful in leading that person.
Yeah, one of the things in our book we encourage people to do is when the first thing you do is to interview the people that you hire, either during the process or after you've hired them, to really understand what they think motivates them, so that you can put that in the back of your mind and manage appropriately. And you do, in fact, figure out what each person, what their hot buttons are, and you either avoid the hot buttons or you want to press them.
Yeah, and that goes back to as Mickey was saying, in recruiting, you're looking at those kinds of things because you're going to put together a package. You don't just offer people salary; we offer them packages. And so there was, I hired a developer a few years ago that committing to his training and his professional growth was far more important than raising the compensation. and figuring out those balance things of what it is that people really value and what they care about, and then once they're working, how they care about their work and their work environment is really important.
Yeah, in our book, there's a section where we talk about developing a formula for each individual that is it's like compensation, what they get to work on, where they get to work from, all these variables, if you will, with a scale, and figure out what the scalars are in front of them for each individual. Is this a high scalar or a low scalar? Is it 1 or is it 0 for these things? And then once you figure that out, you've got a formula to help manage that individual.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. All right, so let's switch topics into maybe the third major thing that we're going to talk about, which is the tools and the state of the tools industry related to this whole world, right? So there's a lot to measure, as we talked about. I think there's a lot of pressure, Ron, as you said, for non-technical managers or executives to want to know what is productivity. How do I know I'm getting the most out of what I'm paying for? All of that. These questions always come up. So I think a lot of vendors are trying to figure that out. So Christian, I'd love to hear your opinion on these tools and the telemetry that's coming out, and how you feel about where the industry is heading.
Yeah, I mean, I'm obviously working on that. It's one of the problems I'm near and dear to my heart. So I think if you look overall, there's a lot of data about engineering and delivery now, especially with DevOps platforms and so on and so in place. But a lot of that data is disconnected. So typically people if you use a work tracking tool, nowadays you use a work tracking tool, you probably are using repository-based analytics and so on and so forth. There's a lot of data that's about the work, and there's also a lot of data about the implementation. And there's a huge number of tools, built into Jira and other things that you can use today. If you're not using data at all, there's plenty of things you can do to start using data today using off-the-shelf tools you probably already have, right? I think the interesting space for me is kind of what happens in the middle. So there's a lot of new breed of companies that have been coming out lately. Myself, I'm working on that too. Is how to integrate all the data that's coming from the business side of things, which is kind of around the work, and the implementation side of things, which is how people build and deliver code. And the DORA metrics are a good example of that. And DORA metrics obviously formalize some of these things that you should measure to connect performance in the field with productivity on the back end. But DORA metrics is mostly around delivery, but implementation is a challenging problem as well. And Mickey has been doing a lot of work on sort of collecting, a whole bunch of tools and so on and so forth, and names of tools and so on. So one of them happens to be one that I'm building to. To me, the holy grail is this notion called delivery cycle analytics, which is being able to understand what it takes to build and deliver the features that your business finds valuable. Understanding the costs, understanding the delays, by looking at how work flows through a pipeline end to end. And there's about 5 or 6 companies out there now building that. And we're all approaching it from different angles. I think it's a wide open space, pretty exciting. And there's also, space because of people are actually thinking about productivity and how to measure it in a more systematic fashion. People at Google have come up with frameworks for this. Nicole Forsgren, who's famous for the Accelerate work, has started working on this, and they have a good set of recommendations. It's not just data, but how do you actually use it holistically, systematically, to build a database, data-driven improvement program. So I actually think this, the industry is in a good space heading into this in the next few years. We'll see a lot of new tools coming out, lots of new ways for people to actually use information, and process for people to actually use that, in day-to-day work as well.
Yeah, interesting. So do you think, in the case of these delivery cycle analytics, are they something that can be used externally for reporting productivity, or are they really more designed to help influence internally, like the cockpit analogy?
It's both. So I think if you're doing this right, then you actually are working off of the same source of truth, right? So the stuff that matters to teams on a day-to-day basis is not what your executives should be concerned about, but there should be a way to connect those two, right? So if your delivery performance is going up or down, there needs to be a rational way to connect that delivery performance to what people do on a day-to-day basis. So it's better, more accurate data, but then connected back to the business, right? So you're actually working off the same source of truth. Right now, everything is disconnected and in silos. So coming up with a single source of truth to do this work, the analytics, is I think a huge effort. It's not easy to do, but I don't know that everybody's figured it out yet. But that's really the direction we need to go in. The engineering world and the business world are very siloed from each other. I think they need to be connected.
Too siloed.
I want to point out that what Krishna's talking about and what Nikki's talking about are really important, which is us as engineering managers having a dashboard that we can look at our engineering teams. But we also need to look at productivity. Productivity is a broader thing than just our engineering teams. It's the point at which it's the connection to the customer through the business into translation to technology through product management and maybe creation of what this thing is that we're going to build that's going to delight our customers into engineering through QA and then back to sometimes back to product management before we release it to customers, and that can get stalled. That can get stalled in a lot of different places along there, and I've got at least one. I've had multiple clients that, oh, can you make our engineering team work better? And you go in and discover, well, they don't have product management. And all the arrows are going in multiple directions, and there's a reason why. There's a reason why. There's no translation from the ideas the business has into a clear, consistent, all the arrows in one direction product idea. There's no roadmap. There's that's really significant stuff. And so we really need to look at the whole ecosystem or the whole flow of stuff.
That's a really interesting point, Ron. I have a really hopefully short example of this in real life where we in the engineering side built a feature and we released it and it actually made it into production. And then a year later on the client surveys, they're like, we really wish we had this feature that was already built and released. And that was like a common thing across multiple customers. And the problem is that somewhere down the road, product management, product marketing, wherever, they forgot to tell people about it. And so, only people that actually wandered into the feature found the feature and used it, but they weren't marketed properly to actually.
No, I see that in my data all the time. I see that.
So that's a good example, Ron, of what you're talking about. That has nothing to do with engineering. There's nothing we could have done better in that case. Not to say that the feature was perfect. I'm just saying, in terms of delivery, we delivered what we were supposed to do on time, and it didn't actually make it to customers and create value.
Right. Nothing we could do better in engineering, and thus we really need to look at that whole flow.
Yeah.
And there's a couple of other things there too. For instance, if you want to answer questions like, if the business wants to answer a question like, why does it take me so long to build this feature that's so valuable to me, right? There's no data to answer that. We can't really go back and say, here is why, our system architecture is not set up to support you, right? In reality, your architecture should serve the business. It should take you the least amount of effort to build the most valuable features. And there's no way for us to talk about that because we don't have the data to understand what effort is, how does it connect to architecture and so on and so forth. So I think that's really where the next few years are going to be. I mean, people are actually starting to figure out how to do this and actually start to make real data-driven decisions on how do you move technical debt, how do you attach, how do you understand how to evolve your architecture by looking at the work that flows through this, right? And I think that's really what's exciting about what's coming up in the future. So.
Yeah, we can properly tease out where there's technical debt that matters. Let's call it that. That would be a great problem because there's plenty of technical debt all over. But if you can properly rank it through some way of determining like that code is always slower than other code or whatever.
And that's really what this new breed of technology is all about. So it's making the connections between the work and what it takes to deliver it, and understanding the importance of the work versus the complexity of building it. And I think that's really kind of, in my mind, that's the holy grail. That's where we need to be moving towards.
So Mickey, I know, like we talked about earlier, or at least I talked about, you've been on this lifelong search for tools. We have a slide the next slide kind of gives your overview of what you're seeing out in the market. Is there anything you want to say about like the state of tools and
So
your view?
yeah, let me just kind of say that this came from a report generated by G2. This URL here, if anyone wants to look it up, and it's mostly driven by user satisfaction, voluntary submissions. How they gathered them, how they got them to actually do that, it's arbitrary. It's not clear. So I don't take it as a very valid scientific review of the tools that are out there, because this looks like it's a very crowded space, but there's a lot more than this.
It's even more crowded than this, is what you're saying.
It's much more crowded than this, and all of them share a few things in common, or most of them, which is to take and derive information from Git or a source control hub of some kind, usually Git or GitLab or Bitbucket, which are all based upon Git, I might add, and extract information from that, which is then presented in a dashboard, although most of the dashboards are lacking in the sense that it's telling you about things you really may not care about. For example, lines of code produced. Do I really care about that, or do I care whether the software works? And so going through this and figuring out which tools work best is a challenging position. I can say it because I've been trying to figure that out for several of these tools. I had the opportunity to have a walkthrough from Krishna on his product Polaris here. I actually added it to this list because I felt like it was worthy of it. But he doesn't even have a public version at this point in time. It's for his clients. But I think that there's different ways of looking at this problem. And for someone who wants to dive in here, it's not a simple, let's choose this one. You need to figure out what you want, what the value you want out of it, and then read the fine print carefully about what actually happens. And then have a test drive. And a test drive usually isn't 2 weeks. You couldn't possibly figure out any of these tools in 2 weeks.
You need about 60 days, really. That's my experience. You need about 60 days of using this before you can actually kind of understand whether your data is clean. It's early stage. This is all mostly early stage products, and we're still figuring out what to do with this. There's lots of different approaches. So, but there's good stuff out there. I mean, there's definitely the state of the world now is definitely better than it was like 3 or 4 years ago, and it's moving fast.
Yeah, it's definitely better, and it's getting better all the time. I have to say, I've seen it morph even in the deep dives I've been doing over the past year. I've seen the tools morph and improve. But I also might add that most of these are trying to take, again, coming off the source control, and this doesn't even cover the QA tools that are out there, and the analytics can be for that, or the security tools that are out there and the analytics that are available for that. And so getting something which covers every part of the spectrum is impossible.
Yeah, so let's leave it there. So let's advance to the next slide. I think there's a couple of things. One, we have a handout available to you that you can see on your side panel. Feel free to download that. And also, there's a bunch of links here under each of our names. Maybe not so much mine. But Ron, Krishna, Nikki, they all have different links here that they think might be useful to you, and highlight some of the things we've talked about today. We don't have a lot more time. I want to thank Nikki, Ron, and Krishna for your participation. I mean, this is a topic that I really enjoy, and I think each of you also enjoys it in your own way. And hopefully the audience got a lot out of it. I want to thank them for joining as well, sticking with us on this. These management topics usually, they're not quite as fun to most people as the technology topics, but I think they're really important because good technologists need good managers.
Amen.
Can I add one more thought at the end there, if we have time? And that's that, in my humble opinion, okay, those who don't pay attention to this space are going to find themselves a competitive advantage in the future, because figuring out how to take and measure the productivity and improve it in whatever way is possible is going to be a competitive advantage. And then those who don't figure that out are going to be left behind.
Yeah, and I do think this space will converge over the next 5 years as artificial intelligence improves, as API management and the ability to connect systems improves. I think there's going to be some technology stack consolidation as well. That's just my instinct. So I think all of those things will make this space even better going forward.
Well, let's combine it with professional judgment.
Yeah. So.
Yeah. Definitely need good professional judgment. Thanks for pointing that out, Ron. All right, guys. Thanks again for your participation, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.